Hi, welcome to Substack Week in Review Unscripted, the inaugural podcast. I am the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I am an economist and a military historian. I have been on Substack for since October of 2023. I typically write 3 to 4 articles with a corresponding audio version of each of the articles that I write. The purpose of this podcast is just to talk about some additional ideas around what I wrote, maybe some additional thoughts. I will not read these verbatim. You can go, please, read the articles or the audio versions that typically come out one day after the written version. So this will just, again, be more of my thoughts on what was going on or the articles that I wrote this week. And if I get favorable feedback, this will be a weekly event. So, the first article I wrote this week was about the Canada's Online Harms Act, or Bill C-63, which is the third act of Trudeau's government's attempt to regulate the internet. This is still in Parliament, so this is not a final version, but the fact that it is even being discussed, it does not look like something that's going to be favorable to Canadian citizens' freedom of speech or association. And this is a case where we see the same problem in the United States, where they promote a bill as actually create an actual real problem. They use that as, quote, the headline or the something to grab your attention, and then they add all this additional regulation to make it something very oppressive, especially in what I'm seeing in Canada. The bill was originally promoted to enact regulation on the social media companies, and it requires them to remove illegal content such as child pornography, abuse, something that you could really feel good about. And it tells the social media platforms you have 24 hours to get rid of this illegal activity, get it offline, so that you don't damage the people irrevocably that were being impacted by this. It is a good act when you think of it, and you look at the feel-good portion of the headline. Hey, nobody cares for child pornography or people being abused illegally, certainly, or any type of revenge pornography, anything like that. So it's definitely a feel-good act when you put it out there up front. And this is probably where you put that in the headlines, and people probably look at it and say, yeah, I feel pretty good about that. I think when I looked at the data, it's about 70% of Canadians feel pretty good about this bill. Again, if you're looking at the headlines, how can you not be against it? But I think when you start really kind of looking at what this bill does, it's kind of, it's scary. It's scary in a lot of aspects of what it takes away from Canadians. They couldn't stop at just writing something that made some type of enforced action to be taken against people doing illegal activities on social media platforms. The bill proposes requiring new content moderation. I guess if you're talking about eliminating child pornography, that would be something that would need to be done in content moderation. But it also adds new regulators to enforce content moderation, and that these new regulators will determine the access to social media data. So the government will determine who can actually get this data, whether it's the government or whether it's somebody assigned to the government. Again, this is still being debated in Canadian Parliament, so a lot of these small details still have to be worked out, and hopefully some of the big details will get worked out. It does add administrative penalties for non-compliance to the social media companies. It adds cost charges because the social media companies have to pay for all the requirements of this bill. So not only are they being restricted through new content moderation, both good, and as you'll see, bad content moderation policy, in my opinion, is they have to pay for this. And they will create what they'll do is they'll amend the Criminal Code of Canada under, that will be determined the new content moderation, so what they call a Digital Safety Ombudsman. So that's where some of the questions come in. So why did you have to update Criminal Code of Canada when we look at already child pornography or something like that is already illegal? It's already in the Criminal Code of Canada. So why does something new have to be added? And so two parts of the bill. It not only does it take the social media companies, adds regulation to them, it also puts regulation on the individuals, the users of social media. So if you find a requirement where they have to take down this information, they have to report to the government, they have to, the social media companies, they have to save the data that they've taken down. So presumably so that these new content moderators can go in there and look at it, and so they can determine who needs to be charged, the individual that needs to be charged. Now, if these social media companies fail to do the duty that's been assigned under this new law, the Online Harms Act, they can be fined up to 6% of their global revenue, not their profits, their revenue. So that's a pretty hefty fine on that. And obviously that's going to go in there, and that the social media companies are going to look at, there's an actual risk that if they fail to do what the Canadian government is asking them to do, that they can actually have crippling penalties per violation. So this means that the social media companies will look at what they can do to support. Can they actually do what the Canadian government is asking them to do? Also, will they self-censor, or will they restrict users, become much more draconian in reducing users' abilities to say things because they don't want to run afoul of government regulators? So, for example, would they block usage of the questions about the Freedom Convoy in its legal battles that are ongoing, but allow Justin Trudeau's government's gun control measures to be displayed prominently on site? Just the idea is that the social media companies are showing that they are acting in good faith to the government. So again, if you're going to sit there and risk 6% of your revenue, then why would you want to find a way that you want to be favorable to the government? You don't want to risk taking that fine, even if you can't. And even some of these fines, they don't, or some of these requirements, they don't know if they're technically able to do these things. So that means they're going to err on the side of caution and not allow certain users. They might sit there and have a much more heavy screening process. You might see much more self-censorship on the platform, almost like a zero tolerance policy. So you're going to see the social media companies probably self-censoring themselves to try to prevent themselves running afoul of the Canadian government. And then, as I said, the Act does have penalties for the social media companies. That's 6% crippling fine. But the individuals are also subject to violations within the Criminal Code and the Human Rights Act of Canada. For example, penalties for some of the hate violations and genocide violations go from 5 years to life in prison. That's not actually sitting there by determination that the Canadian government's going to determine. They're going to be the determiner of what is hate speech and what is promotion of genocide. Not actual genocide, promotion of genocide. So how strict are they going to be? It's not really clear. So again, you're going to this murky thing of what hate speech is, and you've got the subjective requirements of the Canadian Human Rights Commissions, which I guess every province, again, I'm not a Canadian, I'm not up to date on Canadian law, but this is just through my readings, is that every province has their own human rights commissions. So I guess much like we have state courts on things. So, and then the other thing is that, okay, hate speech online will become a discriminatory practice, and that will be subject not to the criminal code, but the human rights commissions. And they can act against individuals that the government has determined is hate speech. So they can issue fines. I don't think they can justify jail time, but they can do prohibitive fines against individuals who break this Online Harms Act. Again, we're not talking just about child pornography. We're talking about the government determining what is hate speech. And then the other terrible thing on this bill is what we call thought crimes, where a bill allows for the arrest and imprisonment of any individual that the government believes may commit hate crimes or distribute hate propaganda. So no actual crime needs to occur. So if no actual crime has occurred, how does one defend themselves in this case? It will be interesting to see how this moves through the Canadian legal system. or if this is something that Justin Trudeau's government can just ram through. Also, there is a part of this where if you follow somebody that's been charged with distributing hate propaganda or some other violation of this act, you don't actually have to do anything. If you're a user and and they think that you are a associate of this person, you can be held to the crime as well. So the case is, for example, if you're a user and you're a follower on social media and you occasionally comment with another user, and that user is charged under these hate speech, there is a possibility that you can be charged for the association as well. So you don't actually have to commit a crime. Just somehow they believe that, hey, you're a follower, you are an associate of this person, even though you may not have commented on anything. So again, you haven't actually committed a crime, but they think you're association. You are also subject to penalties, which I think includes house arrest and fines. So this bill not only rejects freedom of speech, but also freedom of association. Now, Canada doesn't have the First Amendment. They don't believe in unalienable rights. The idea is that the Canadian government is, like many Western and liberal democracies in the world, the government gives you the rights. You're not born with an inalienable right. So those are some of those things about this Canadian Online Harms Act. I just hope this is something that our leaders in Congress decide that this is a good idea and that's something that they would want to approve. So just make sure that we have to be vigilant down here in the lower states here, that Canada's neighbors, that we make sure that there's not any attempts to water down the First Amendment, and that no such legislation could ever be found here. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure there will be more to come as we start seeing it move through the Canadian Parliament. The next one is talking about Emmanuel Macron's proposal for Ukraine is gaining traction. This is a case in February 2024. French President Emmanuel Macron broached the previous taboo subject of sending NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, this was something that was rejected by many leaders, and it's been something that we've been hearing more and more in the States, and even in the West, other Western countries, is that that the West, NATO, United States, other countries, would be willing to send arms to the Ukraine, but there was no ever discussion of sending troops. We train Ukrainian forces, we, the West, NATO, train Ukrainian army, and in this case, we're training Air Force pilots to learn to fly F-16s that haven't been deployed yet. But the idea is now they've always talked about, hey, we're never going to send ground troops. Now they are actually, Macron's bringing up the subject of deploying ground troops in an unspecified role inside the Ukraine itself. The proposed roles, I imagine it's probably going to look at something like directly training, maybe defending defense production sites. For example, I think the European Union and even the United States are looking at setting up artillery production sites inside Ukraine to help them produce more weapons. Of course, these have to be defended either through air defense, and of course they can't be built too close to either eastern or southern Ukraine where the fighting is. So these will have to be protected against airstrikes, and they're expecting that there's going to be Western technicians to help set these factories up and to help run the factories, or at least train Ukrainian workers to be able to run these factories. Or the idea is that, hey, they just take over parts of the country. They take over the north where the Russians are not active, and help free up Ukrainian forces to move to the east and to the south, thus not having to cover the Belarus area, and they don't have to cover Kyiv anymore. That would be done by NATO troops as one of the proposals. Not necessarily as one of the proposals. Again, the idea is still being defined. The idea is just broaching the subject. Now, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States have all rejected the idea of Macron's idea, but Macron hasn't backed off on this. He continues to talk more and more about it. Macron has also been critical of the U.S. or Europe being too reliant on the U.S. to provide weapons, and that this is something, it's a Europe problem, and that Europe needs to step up and take a leading role. I wonder, the French have always been a unique player in NATO in the West, so this is probably more the same of the France trying to take a leadership role within NATO. Certainly welcome in many regards, but sometimes I wonder about the motivation of France. Again, going back all the way to Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s. One issue that came up from this is Macron has not backed down on this, and that Russian President Vladimir Putin said that this could be a precipitation towards a nuclear attack. Macron, for his point of view, says that NATO is a nuclear power. Mainly, the weapons come from the United States and France, but he's speaking from France's perspective, is that, hey, they're a nuclear power as well, and they are ready for a nuclear war. Kind of a scary way to think about it, especially people who have lived through the Cold War and the actual threat of nuclear destruction. So seeing two leaders, Russia and France, talking so freely about nuclear attacks. I know Putin has threatened it, and Putin's allies have threatened it in the past, but a little bit disconcerting that they're talking about a nuclear attack at this point in the just the idea of discussing this and what this could possibly look like as far as sending troops to Ukraine. Now, the idea is that, hey, this has been a red line. I said all these countries have said, hey, we're never going to send, all these NATO countries say, hey, we're not sending troops to Ukraine. We're just sending weapons, and we're going to help train them and train Ukraine troops outside of Ukraine and then send them back to Ukraine. But this is so it's been a red line. Hey, no troops being sent. But NATO has crossed every red line that's been presented in the 3 years that this war has been going on, or the third year that this war has gone on. It's gone 2 full years, and we're in the third year. Is they said, hey, we're not sending Western battle tanks, no long-range weapons capable of striking Russia, no cluster munitions. We're not going to send Western fighter aircraft. All of these red lines have been crossed at one point or another. So red lines with NATO is malleable. So is Macron wrong for bringing this up? I feel uncomfortable with the idea of widening this war, but there's probably some positives that you can sit there if you want to take the French position that you are definitely worth considering. The other thing is that this is not really a new proposal. This is something that back in 2023, the previous NATO Secretary General Rasmussen had brought up as something as deploying NATO troops inside Ukraine to take over some of the quieter sections of Ukraine, and also starting to provide the idea of air defense into Ukraine, whether that meant no-fly zones or providing more anti-aircraft systems. So again, it's not really a new proposal. It's just now somebody, a actual country, a national leader has taken this to heart. Now, the advantage that I talked about is that this can serve one of two purposes. It can introduce strategic ambiguity to the war. We're going to hear that again in the next article, because Russia doesn't have to worry about any in its actions introducing NATO ground troops, at least not to this point. So the risk is that if Putin takes overt action over and above what he already has as far as overt action, plenty of overt action has already occurred, that it could become a red line for NATO to deploy forces. So I think Macron is kind of putting that line out there. It says, if you do this, then there's a possibility that we could deploy troops to counter this new escalation by the Russians. It increases, also the flip side, it increases the likelihood of a wider war. because putting NATO troops into Ukraine might be a red line for the Russians. But again, they will have to look at, do they really want to fight NATO countries in this? So it might look at the point is that they just want to draw down operations, make it a low simmering war, and not do anything to provoke the West or NATO from deploying troops. Now, this has gotten some traction despite Germany, the UK, and the United States saying no way. Poland and Finland said they both have to be open to the idea, or that NATO needs to be open to the option. And recently, a U.S. Army colonel for, I think, went to Radio Free Europe and said that this is something that needs to be considered. And he started talking about conditions and roles that NATO forces could do under that. Now, I talk about this in the article, is NATO and the EU are very divided over the role inside Ukraine. Now, it doesn't really, it has affected funding as far as sending funds to help, the European Union sending funds to Ukraine, because you've seen some, mainly through Hungary, the veto power to slow down or stop sending aid to Ukraine, because you require unanimous consent within the EU to be able to do any major policy change. NATO is the same way. There is no way, and Putin knows this, there's no way the NATO country, that Russia knows that there's no way NATO is going to be unanimous and consent to sending troops to Ukraine. Obviously, Hungary's opposed to it. Most likely, you will see Turkey opposed to it. And you only need one. So there's going to be at least two countries, and I imagine there will be some others that will be less interested to do this. So the Russians have known, hey, that we don't have to worry about it, because there's no way they're going to get unanimous support within NATO to do this. And the European Union does not have an army of its own. But what could happen is NATO member states could send troops to Ukraine outside of NATO authority. So they would not be acting in NATO. They would not have Article 5 protections, but they could be deployed as individual countries. So, for example, member of an EU, a member of NATO, France can send troops. I'm just throwing out countries, so nobody's committed to this. France sends troops, and then Germany decides to send troops, and Poland decides to send troops. They're all NATO members, but they are not acting within NATO. So this means that all of a sudden Putin's calculus that there's no way there would be unanimous consent for such action is gone. So all of a sudden his calculus for widening the war has now been drastically affected, because there's no longer unanimous consent to send troops that are NATO troops, but not acting under the NATO umbrella, that could be sent to Ukraine. So the question is what does this do? Obviously, it risks a wider war. It also creates a lot of risk for the West. If they threaten this and they say, hey, there's a condition that we will send troops in, and they don't do it, the West is going to look impotent, which means they could become reckless to make sure they don't look impotent to the rest of the world, so that their threats have to look credible. So there is a risk that this could create a wider war. It could also believe that the Russians could look at it a point of view as, no, we'll just keep it as a low-level simmering war, knowing that Ukraine won't join NATO while it's in an active war. So the Russians could just keep the war going on a low level, and it could achieve its stated purpose, or one of its stated purposes is not to allow Ukraine to join NATO. So that is a possibility in this war as well. So it could incentivize the Russians to sit there, and also they decide they want to get out of this war, and not just keep it as a low simmering war. They could sit there and say, okay, well, we want to end the war. We don't want to risk a wider war with the West. But then the Ukrainians could try to take advantage of the Russians openness to end the war by becoming more aggressive in their peace requirements. Already they have President Zelensky of Ukraine has requirements of the 10-point peace plan, which is utterly ridiculous peace plan. It's no real blueprint. Just we could talk more about it later. I did write some articles on it as well. It's something that's just not a credible peace plan. But then they could be, if the Russians signal that they want to get out of this war and not risk a wider war with the Russians, the Ukrainians might become more aggressive and keep the war going. So it does have a lot of risk for Europe, does have a lot of risk for the Russians. There is some upside where it does create strategic ambiguity, is that the Russians no longer know what NATO and the West are going to do. It reduces or eliminates the requirement of unanimous consent. So the risk of a Western reaction inside Ukraine are higher. But then again, the trade-off is the West could possibly put their troops in harm's way, and it might also be a red line for the Russians not to start a wider war. So that was some of the articles. So I went on quite a bit. This is definitely an interesting proposal. You can see ups or downs. I try to see, even though I would say that I'm against this policy. If you've read any of my articles, I generally want to see this war end. I do see Ukraine is the aggrieved party, but I do want to find a way to end the killing in this region and try to de-escalate the situation in Europe. But I try to see some of the upsides of these articles, and I try to do that in a lot of ways right. I won't say that about the Canadian Online Harms Act. Outside of stopping child pornography, I don't see anything good in that act. So the third article this week was about U.S. Special Forces being sent to Taiwan and some unusual changes to the status this week. So Admiral Aquilino testified. He is the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and he's actually leaving soon. Gave a presentation U.S. House Armed Services House Committee, and he talked about that he believes that a war is possible over Taiwan, a Chinese invasion or a People's Republic of China invasion of the Republic of China or Taiwan by 2027. So his point is that war is not imminent, despite all the saber rattling that you see from the Chinese government, threatening to invade Taiwan, creeping up the airspace closer and closer to Taiwan. Coast Guard, Chinese Coast Guard, intervening inside some of the economic zones of Taiwan. So obviously provocations from China, but he says it's not. In his view, Admiral Aquilino says that it's not imminent, and he says that war is not a foregone conclusion either. So even though he says China could be ready by 2027, it doesn't not mean that we can't avoid it. But what we're seeing today, that what caused the interest this week was the U.S. deployed special forces from this first special forces group to Taiwan, and the U.S. government has not given a number. It's estimated 100 to 200 soldiers. That's not unusual. Those soldiers have been there since 2023. What was unusual was that the U.S. has always deployed forces to Taiwan to help train, usually special forces, Marines, sometimes airmen, on a announced temporary basis. They have a specified role. Training, helping the Taiwanese with new equipment, new procedures, but very short duration and no more than a few dozen military members at any given time. So being 100 or 200 is an unusually high number, and the unusual part was the defense minister, Chi Kuo-cheng, I believe I pronounced that right, of Taiwan. He said that these members are permanent. These are permanently deployed members of the United States to Taiwan. Admiral Aquilino said they are not permanent, but he would not give open testimony on what their actual status is within Taiwan, unless he was going to discuss it in a classified briefing with the members of the House. So that raises questions because he could not outright say that it was not a permanent deployment, or he says it's not a permanent deployment, but not specifying that it's a temporary deployment. So that does raise some questions. The other shocking thing that came from the defense minister of Taiwan was that the special forces are operating in the Kinmen Islands. And some of these islands are within a few miles of the Chinese mainland coast. You can look at some of the pictures online, and you can see that one of the Kinmen Islands has a Taiwanese flag printed in the rocks just to show off to the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Republic of China, probably just to, for lack of a better word, piss them off. It's within a few miles of the coast. I think it's like within 3 miles of the Chinese coast, and it's a major city. It's right there. So U.S. Special Forces are operating in the Kinmen Islands, and the Kinmen Islands does include being that close to China. And in fact, I think the Kinmen Islands, the closest it is 100 miles away from mainland Taiwan, or the main part of the big island of Taiwan. So the U.S. forces are very close to China. So China, for their part, have been relatively quiet on this deployment. Again, the deployment has not been, it's not new, but the status of saying it's permanent is new. And the release that they are operating on the Kinmen Islands is also new. So the cases are if this is a permanent deployment, this could be a real change in the U.S. strategic policy or position in regards to Taiwan. Since the 1970s, strategic ambiguity, bringing up that term again, has been the U.S. position. It has always been assumed that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the case of an invasion, but it was not. The U.S. was basically non-committal. They wouldn't talk about their potential reaction. I know that during the Clinton administration, when the Chinese were talking or acting up, threatening Taiwan, he did sail a aircraft carrier battle group down the Taiwanese Strait. So probably would not do something like that now because of some of the improved missile capabilities of the Chinese. But it's always been assumed that the U.S. would defend it, but it would not commit itself either way. Now the case goes in here is if we're putting a large number, I'm going to say 100, 200 troops is a large number, the U.S. is moving to a deterrence policy. And why I'm saying that is why it's becoming a deterrence posture is that the U.S. troops become a tripwire. The Chinese now know if they attack the Kinmen Islands, because they're obviously going to have to take the Kinmen Islands before they can move into the main part of the Taiwanese islands. So there's a risk that they could kill U.S. troops or capture them. And so this is a tripwire. So this increases the Chinese risk of invading Taiwan if from the outright they kill American soldiers. This would probably be something that would incense the American public. So it does look like a case where we're not putting so many forces in there to cause an issue for China to act immediately, or at least that's hoped. But it does mean that there's a small enough number that a sizable amount of U.S. casualties could occur in a Taiwanese invasion. And the Chinese know that now, so that they know if they invade, they could kill U.S. servicemen. So that means they have to decide whether they want to invade Taiwan at all. Now, the risk that this comes from one of the foreign policy position papers, and it's talking about, okay, if you invade, or the U.S. starts deploying troops and starts training up Taiwanese forces, the defenses for Taiwan are going to get better and better and better, which is going to make the cost in lives, personnel, and technical ability, maybe even to build armed forces up on the Chinese side, becomes greater and greater and greater. So as the defensive capability of the Taiwanese gets greater, the cost to the Chinese gets greater. So if only 200 forces, 100 to 200 U.S. forces, and China really wants to take Taiwan, it's probably going to be better to take it now or sooner, 2027, rather than later, 2040, which is some of the discussions that when President Xi Jinping of China says that he wants China to be a world-class military by 2040. They'll have their third biggest aircraft carrier by 2038. So yes, it's a case where the cost for taking Taiwan now is probably going to be the lowest levels if they move sooner rather than later. So yes, there's an incentive to take Taiwan now. Do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't think the Chinese are ready for that right now. And ultimately, they would have to fight Japan as well, because taking Taiwan would most likely require taking some Japanese islands as well that are disputed as being either Japanese or Chinese, but the Japanese at this point are the occupiers of those islands. So they risk a wider war if they go ahead and invade Taiwan now or later. So does China look at it as, does the risk become greater for an armed invasion as time goes on, as the defenses get better and better, both in the U.S., Taiwan, maybe the U.S. starts pre-positioning equipment for rapid mobilization of U.S. forces into the island? That's a possibility. So again, the risks are going to become higher and higher the longer China waits. So either they need to act sooner, and that's going to be those tripwires of U.S. service personnel, so they become a deterrent factor to China instead of a strategic ambiguity. Or does China just look at it from the point of view is, okay, the risks are going to be too high to risk a war with the U.S., Taiwan, possibly Japan, or U.S. and its allies, probably bring in Australia as well, maybe the Philippines. The Philippines are pretty aggressive towards China right now, and it's vice versa. So the question comes into is, what does China do? And the reason why China now has to make a decision, do they want to try giving up forceful unification and try to pursue some type of peaceful reunification with Taiwan and give up the idea of armed takeover? Or do they just want to change their posture altogether and just leave it as the status quo, as Taiwan being a de facto independent country, which I believe it is an independent country and should remain an independent country. It is not part of China. China has not been owner of the Formosa or Taiwan for a very, very long time, and certainly the Chinese Communist Party never had a position within the island of Formosa, Taiwan. So yes, I do believe that the ideas claiming that they have that island as part of China, I don't agree with. The Chinese Communist Party have never been an active member. But the Chinese point of view is it's part of China. They do look at the whole diaspora across the world as these are Chinese citizens and need to be held accountable to Chinese communist laws and requirements. So in the end, China has to decide. Do they want to risk invading Taiwan earlier at a lower casualty, 2027, for example, as Admiral Aquilino said, later at a higher cost in the 2030s, 2040s, or do they just want to give up the idea of armed unification altogether and take the safer route? So please read more on those papers. Those were just some of my additional thoughts. I know I kind of rambled on, but I want to give you some of my additional thoughts that I couldn't necessarily put on paper, and maybe some of my point of views where I was getting in there. Also, it'd be very interesting to see this week. Obviously, many of you have heard about the attack in Moscow. 115, last I saw, were killed in a terrorist attack. The Islamic State has taken credit for the attack. The U.S. has stated that the Islamic State was responsible. There is some grumbling within maybe the FSB, the Russian intelligence service, the one that took over the KGB, and Moscow police, that some of them were thinking that maybe Ukraine is involved. I'm not sure what I think about that. President Zelensky of Ukraine has denied that. And I tend to lean towards, if the Ukrainians resorting to a terrorist attack against a purely civilian target. I know that civilian targets have been bombed by the Russians inside Ukraine, but the fact that they're attacked like it's some type of terrorist attack inside Russia, at the time that France is pushing to deploy NATO or Western troops to Ukraine, I don't think the West would be very open to the idea of a Ukraine sponsoring a terrorist attack inside Russia. So I tend to think, and I could be wrong, and I think this is one of the things that's going to play out over the next few days, weeks, is we'll see more and more of that to come. I don't know really what to say about that. If it was the Islamic State, Russians are going to be somewhat hamstrung to be able to do airstrikes against somebody like Aleppo. They're pretty tied down in the Ukraine right now. So not sure how the Russians can retaliate if it is the Islamic State. Not sure what actions they will take if they make a determination, whether real or as a false flag against the Ukrainians. So definitely something to keep an eye on. So that is the first inaugural podcast. Or the Week in Review podcast. I will put more thoughts into it later and see what I can do better. Again, this is truly unscripted. I don't have a script like when I do the weekly audio versions of my papers. I'm pretty much reading verbatim to what's in the papers. It's also, as a side note, that's often where I catch a lot of my grammar mistakes. I don't write rough drafts, but I obviously miss something. I do write these papers. It takes about 3 to 4 hours of research and about 1 to 2 hours of writing. Then I have to read them, and I try to post every other day. So sometimes I do have grammatical errors or some weird sentence structures, and I do apologize for that. I usually, once I read it and I find, for the audio versions, and I find mistakes, I go back and try to correct those mistakes. So again, I know sometimes it seems my writing can be have a grammatical error or two. I'm trying to get better at that, just as I will try to get better at this podcast. So, if you like my content, please take a moment to subscribe on Substack. That would help improve my my reach. And if you feel like joining as a paid subscriber, that would help a lot, as this is completely self-funded as far as the research. It's kind of, I don't have a lot of expenses, but I do have to pay for a lot of the newspaper sites to be able to continue writing like this. So it's not overly expensive. I put up the upfront costs, so I'm a little bit in the hole. But again, even just joining as an unpaid member, free member, that helps as well, because that helps my reach. Because the more people I have subscribed to my service, the more reading I have, and then I can start seeing more and more my content showing up in search outside of Substack. So I'm also on LinkedIn under Pegasus Research, where I also do post my articles. I do post articles on X, formerly Twitter, under Pegasus Research. Of course, I'm on Substack as Pegasus Research. So again, feel free to, or please consider joining as a subscriber, both either free or paid. That would be greatly appreciated. And until next time, hope all of you have a great day and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you. Bye.